we are still engaged in the process of, as the saying goes, pinning the tail on the donkey of the not self, drawing aside the veil and exposing that human self for what it is. Many of the deeply entrenched patterns that are so insidiously familiar to the consciousness that they seem to be absolutely an indelible part of selfhood, of true identity, when in fact they are worlds apart. As far as east is from west are the differences between your divine self and your mortal self. So for a little while then, we are going to again address those things, because the path that you are engaged in, this steep path to the full measure of your Christhood, necessarily brings these things out of hiding. And inevitably, there is a certain amount of a process that takes place where whatever there is of this unreal mortal soul consciousness must go into the flame, and 100% of it must be no more. Absolutely cannot exist any longer. Now, that process is not intended to be one of human struggle, although it might seem to be that way for you, to the extent that you still have any conscious or subconscious attachments to that human self. So we're going to talk about it again for a few moments from a number of those vantage points. The first thing about this path that you will have to truly realize is that in very short order, the rest of your life as an unascended life stream, whether you conclude your ascension at the close of this embodiment or the close of the next embodiment, still, what remains is but the blink of an eye in comparison to how long you have been incarnated on the earth in the fallen estate. All right, what are some of these qualities, these human qualities that have become so part and parcel to our outer consciousness? One of them is the unconscious or subconscious degree of attachment that still remains to elements of this world. That might seem to be a hard thing to pin down, but there is a tendency, especially early on the path, to have difficulty relinquishing certain aspects of mortal life. Now, hopefully nobody is quaking in their boots to hear those terms, to hear that concept, fearful that something of worth is actually being asked for you to forsake, to do without. Let me say in advance that nothing that is truly good will ever be sacrificed to the cause of your ascension or to the path of initiation. But on the other hand, there are many, many creature comforts many types of human experience that have become very dyed-in-the-wool and very familiar over long periods of time. And those who are neophytes on the path start out with the mistaken assumption that they can have the path and some of the things or more of the things of the world simultaneously. That you can do both, satisfy both. And that is a recipe for tragedy. Jesus said it so succinctly, a house divided against itself cannot stand. No one can serve two masters, for you're bound to love the one and hate the other. And that is what the human condition is in relation to the divine self. It is a house divided against itself. You have the agenda, the divine plan of the God self, and its vision of what the future holds. And then you have what has been the entrenched position. The word in Greek is tolma, which means audacity. You have the audacious defiance and rebellion against the God self by the outer self. And in the mistaken belief, some early on the path have felt as if they could passively receive from the ascended masters the blessings that the masters would give, bask in the radiance of that light, have the blessings of the path in that sense, the things that are needed for wealth or health or relationships or whatever might be the worldly objectives that someone brings to the work when they first find the path. And somehow there is the sense that it is possible to straddle both worlds, the divine and the human. And many neophytes will put themselves to an unbearable strain over long periods of time, trying to do both. Early on in the work of the temple, we had a saying for this. It's like trying to have one foot in the canoe and the other foot in the water. That is a recipe for imbalance and for a dunking that is not a baptism. So that's a very nice way of saying something, a very seemingly innocuous way of saying something, but it is one of the most profound truths about this steep path to Christhood. When you consider the long span of all of your earthly incarnations, how familiar this world has been to you, how attached you've become to it, how your mind, your outer mind, has set in kind of an inflexibility about itself into the grooves, the habit patterns of mortal thinking. And now what you are preparing to do is you are preparing to exit this realm altogether in a very short order. And in order for you to do that, you really must commit yourself, heart and mind, body, soul, spirit, everything. Commit yourself to the realization of your God presence and the forsaking of the human identity, the soul consciousness. In this regard, you have a great blessing as Ascended Master students, because prior to the release of the knowledge of God individualized as the mighty I Am Presence, even high initiates on the path did not dream that their selfhood was already fully fashioned and self-individualized by their God presence long before their first incarnation, and that they were safe and sound in that divine selfhood, and could therefore release the grip on the sense of a self or an ego that was invested in the consciousness of the soul. So that is one of the things that inevitably is involved in the path. There's no getting around it. In fact, the more that the real light comes forth, the more that the Ascended Master light enters your world, the more that the light of your own God presence comes down. As that light pours into the four lower bodies, and especially as it pours into the memory body, it is a challenge to unreality. And those two things are mortal enemies, if you will. There is no Cold War truce between the light of the I Am Presence and the human ego. They really both cannot occupy the same force field of consciousness. And they are, in a sense, in a very real sense, engaged in what would appear from the human perspective to be a combat to the death. One or the other is going to occupy the force field. One or the other is going to drive the other out of the force field. And the thing about this human ego that is quite astonishing in some respects is that it has a visceral instinct for self-preservation at all costs. And so the carnal mind, operating as it does operate on the mental plane, is sensitive on that psychic plane and really does sense the oncoming light of the Christ, of the God presence, and instinctively understands that if that light fills the whole tabernacle, the whole being, that this human self is going to be completely dissolved and consumed and annihilated. And so it will work up whatever kind of compromise works in an individual student's life. For some, it will be a form of temptation. For others, it will be forms of intimidation. For others, it will be sympathy. The gamut of the types of devices that the mortal consciousness will utilize in order to maintain its control over the outer self are almost endless. But you must understand that it will not do to remain in that no man's land. You know, when you have warring armies dug in to their trenches on opposing sides of each other, the area in between is called no man's land, which is a very, very dangerous place to be. And so there really are there's no truce, there's no middle way. When you really engage in the path sincerely, it is a vertical, steep, strenuous, striving, and aspiring to the God presence. In the early days of the Empire of Rome, some of the first emperors had a very telling statement to make about their place in the scheme of the empire. At those times, the legions of the armies were very independent-minded. And in fact, many times the legions made the emperors and unmade the emperors. And so some of them had the saying that it was as if they had a ravening wolf by the ears, and they didn't dare let go, because even that process of letting go was to leave themselves vulnerable to the attack of that. Now, the answer for this lies in an uncompromising stand for the light. It lies in not having any nostalgia for the past, not having any sympathy for one's own human condition, not having any wistfulness about what you might be leaving behind as you are going on into the God presence. It means that you choose the ascended master way of life as the path for you. And that ascended master way of life is something that you are engaged in as your full life. It's not going to church on Christmas and Easter Sundays and basically picking and choosing which parts of worldly experience you will still enjoy and which parts of religion you will enjoy. No, it is an all-encompassing, all-consuming way of life. I know many times there have been students who've been very drawn to the Ascended Masters, to their mighty I Am presence, and they've come close to the White Fire Core. And they have found themselves in this whirlwind of the upward thrust to the God presence that literally would take their breath away. And they would step back, saying to themselves, I didn't quite realize how all-consuming this path would be, how much it would envelop me. But really and truly, if you are to be like Elijah and to be lifted up by the chariot of fire in the victory of the Ascension, you are going into Ascended Master realms, which are realms of God reality. And it's a one-way journey. After that ascension, you are not going to reincarnate, ever to straddle both worlds ever again. So you have to really decide what you're going to do and commit to it fully. Jesus used a number of parables to drive home that point. One was the pearl of great price that someone found out in the field, and that person went out and sold every last possession they had in this world, gathered up all the money so that they could buy the field where that pearl of great price was. Somebody else, instead of it being that pearl, they had a particular piece of jewelry or something that they had lost within their house, and they cleaned house, they did everything just to secure that thing. The point is that it is a total commitment to the path. And it is a commitment that needs to survive until you draw your final breath. It's not a path that you engage in for 5 years, and then you go back out into what is proverbially called the real world, which is not the real world at all, although it is referred to in that way. You must develop an escape velocity in your momentum of the light that will catapult you entirely beyond the grip of the gravity of mortal thought and feeling. And in order for that to take place, your beloved mighty I am presence must be the be-all and the end-all of your life. That which you put first, that which you wish to embody at whatever the cost might be. And I assure you that when you make such a commitment, which you are really making to your mighty I am presence, you're not making it to the hierarchy of light, you're making it to your mighty I am presence. When you make that commitment, that empowers the ascended masters as well as your own God presence to reinforce your efforts on every possible opportunity in ways that you would never dream possible. But first, there must be that wholehearted commitment. Said this recently at a meeting of the Collegia. One of the highest compliments that we as representatives can ever pay to any life stream is to designate them a lifer. Someone who is committed to this path, come what may, so long as they draw breath. Not looking to the right or to the left to see what even one other person might do or choose, but putting that path really and truly first in their life. I might go on to point out that putting God first in your life ultimately will mean that every other person and everyone else in your life will be blessed. And it's really not possible to achieve the victory if there is any equivocation about that commitment to the path. Another part of this same theme is that which is referred to as the reluctant Chela syndrome. Cosmic law is cosmic law. The principles are impersonal and are absolutely universal. None of the brotherhood invented the rules that govern probation. They are what they are. They are impersonal to the nth degree. It is the work of the brotherhood to set those principles before you, to lay them out, to educate you about what those principles are, about how your God presence and how all the ascended masters conform to cosmic law. And then it is for each student to choose to embrace those disciplines wholeheartedly for themselves. And having done so, not to go around with a long face, not to go around in a sense, how to depict this. The idea is that The standards are set by cosmic law. Those who embrace the path embrace those principles, and they do so without recrimination to their ascended master sponsors or to anyone else. Nor do they beat their chest and look for the pity of other people or the commiseration of others to commiserate in the rigors of the path that they themselves have chosen. Because you are no longer the Christ child, but you are the Christ grown to full stature. So you will put away childish things, and you will embrace that path in the spirit of self-discipline and self-correction without a murmur or a complaint or blame placed upon any part of the brotherhood for cosmic law being what it is. It is what it is. Rest assured that only for a certain cycle of opportunity will there be that doorway held open for those who are new to the path to embrace that path with the help of the ascended masters, the honeymoon period, if you will, when there is extraordinary assistance that is given to the student. But once you have had the confirmation of the light of your presence, and once you have been schooled in what are the clean use of life, what are the disciplines of the path, then at that point, everyone is expected to take responsibility for their own path and joyfully engage in whatever monitoring and correcting of their own outer self that is needed. And that must come forth spontaneously from within the life stream. This is something that you should really and truly understand. Just as explained to you how El Moria and the other members of the masters look at the probationary path, so too the masters make no unwilling or complaining chelas. If someone chafes under what happens to be the principles of cosmic law and wants to continue to berate the fact that those principles exist, the masters are not going to forever strive with the fleshly nature of that student. Somewhere in the Old Testament, that very famous statement is made, "My spirit will not always strive with flesh." That is the response of the brotherhood to those attitudes of the reluctant Chela syndrome. So there again, that principle too must be understood by all of you and by all who would like to engage in that steep path to Christhood. Another of the qualities that is ingrained in mortal consciousness is a certain sense of helplessness, a sense of being without the requisite resources to actually correct what needs to be corrected in your own life and in the world at large. This stems from the fact that all of this outer earth plane, three-dimensional universe is basically, even from the scientific standpoint, living on borrowed energy. I don't have the time tonight to go into that concept, but basically everything is an equation where energy is being borrowed from elsewhere. And ever since the fall and the appearance of the dual self, the not self, that not self has been encased in this encapsulation of what Plato called the cave of mortality. And within that, all that manages to get through is a minimal trickle charge of the crystal cord energies. It's a precious little apportionment of the limitless light and life that otherwise could be available. And so not having the self-sustaining momentums for themselves then begins the whole chain reaction of what we have here in this outer world, which is the Darwinian form of the survival of the fittest, where one species makes its dinner off of other species, and where the one who does the best job of climbing to the top of the heap and of literally living off of the energy of other parts of life is the one who is the king of the jungle, so to speak. And so the mortal consciousness basically starts with that premise. That is the human consciousness, that there is a finite amount of light or energy or whatever the case might be. And what you do not have, what the outer self does not have of its own resources, it must borrow or steal or usurp or trick or somehow or another live off of the productivity of other parts of life. Sunlight shines to the earth. The plants take their energy from the sunlight. The animals take their energy from the plants. Human beings physically think that they take their energy from the plants and animals. And that is where human nature begins. And so here in the 21st century, what is one of the greatest things that is going on far and wide across the face of the earth? The unbelievable links that technologies and peoples go through in order to glean precious droplets of energy from the earth, from coal, from oil, from solar power, from nuclear power. But the fact of the matter is that all of that is external and it is all borrowed. It is none of it really produced. And the difference for the path is that is not the consciousness of each individual I am presence. Each mighty I am presence truly looks to no external source, because each is an individualization of the one, an individualization of the Godhead. And that is the right relationship to reality. That is the consciousness of your own I am presence, and is in fact what is intended to come through the unfed flame of the heart, and to overcome that poverty consciousness of the outer consciousness that seems to be feeling itself so helpless, without recourse, so much the buffeted about and the receiving the brunt of a host of external forces that are essentially beyond its own control. Part of this mystery is involved in what we started to unfold for you this afternoon, which is the nature of the divine spark of the great God flame that also goes by the name the unfed flame. Even in that term, unfed, is captured the consciousness that it is not fueled by anything of the world in which it operates. For example, John F. Kennedy's grave in Arlington, there burns a, quote, unfed flame. But is it really unfed? Of course not. It's fed by whatever source of propane feeds up from beneath the surface of the earth. But your unfed flame is not fed by the earth, the water, the air, the fire, the akasha, any of those. Your unfed flame is not really even sourced by the great central sun, for that spark of divinity comes down from the great God flame and the great I am, and is the Lord of all of those realms. It is Lord of life, Lord of light, Lord of being, authority over everything in creation. That is the consciousness that is seated within the electronic body as the consciousness of your own mighty I am presence. And it is the consciousness that has to be reborn within the four lower bodies. It has to no longer be that tiny little spark or that little flame barely 1/16 of an inch in height. It is intended to billow out and to fill the whole aura. For example, in the mind body, in the mental body, and especially in that ancient body that is known as the memory or the soul, that flame is intended to fill that body from within and out, from the center of that memory vehicle, and to raise it up in vibration until that memory body takes on the self-luminosity and takes on the consciousness that is being exuded by that unfed flame, which consciousness is none other than the very consciousness of your own I am presence. Now, one of the ways that you can work on expanding your realization of that unfed flame is to work with one of the terms coined by beloved Saint Germain thousands of years ago, some of his earlier spiritual focused embodiments as Plato and Proclus, when he used the Greek word hyparxis in a very specific definition. Take, for example, if you will please, the image of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Right now, it is without its capstone, known as the Ben. Put the capstone back on the Great Pyramid. Then levitate the Great Pyramid, not making it weightless, but lifting it up, and then turn it upside down and leave it perfectly balanced so that all of the mass of that Great Pyramid, all of it is brought to bear on one mathematical point. So that all of those many, many tons of weight and pressure are brought to bear on one geometric point, the apex of the pyramid, which is that capstone, or the stone that the builders rejected. If you can hold that image for a little bit and then extrapolate the symbol of the pyramid to the symbol of the great God flame, to be the great I am, and to consider that all that the great I am is brought to a pinpoint mathematical abstract point of focus, with all of the attributes of God the One and God the Good, all being brought to bear on that one point, which, by the way, they are. Because the name of your God flame or your God self is I am presence. And the first part of that name, the I, is this focus to the point of concentration of all that the am part of the presence and all that the presence part of the presence is. All of the presence and all of the am are all brought to that one point of concentration. And then that is the divine spark that comes down into the electronic, the causal, the buddhic body, and animates the four lower bodies as well. As the great I am, it is decidedly and positively, absolutely defies any human concept of quantification or human limitation whatsoever. It is limitless in its power, limitless in its consciousness, limitless in its goodness. It is the epitome of God, the One, individualized. There are actually counterparts of this that we can find in nature that are not the same as this hyparxis of the unfed flame exactly, but they certainly will stretch your mind's imagination when you realize that even worldly science has begrudgingly had to admit that such things do exist. For example, at the deep in the busy metropolis in the center of every galaxy, almost every one of the large galaxies has deep within its heart what is known as a supermassive black hole. Black hole is an unfortunate term, but it is the term that we're left to use, christened by those who wish to discredit the principle when it was first brought forth. Supermassive means that many of these have been inferred to contain as much mass as hundreds of our suns. Some as 200 or more, 200 million solar masses, as much as 200 million of our suns. And how much space do those supermassive black holes take up? A singularity that is a mathematical point. All of the matter, all of the light and energy, everything is collapsed down to where it still exerts the gravitational tug on the galaxy surrounding it. But it is all concentrated there to that nth degree. So too is the light of your own mighty I Am presence concentrated in the unfed flame of your heart. If you can realize that this is in no way separated from the I am presence. It is the very nature of the I am presence itself. And therefore, the very power and God control that the I am presence wields is thanks to this, the science of this threefold unfed flame that your heart is. And that is animating these vehicles, affording them integration, vitality, the ability to think with, the ability to feel with. Only for most of the human race, it is a usurped authority that is basically misappropriated by the outer self and obliged to serve the purposes of the not self. So we are then going to decide that we are going to awake to the truth of who we are, and we are going to decide that inasmuch as we are that beloved mighty I am presence, we will no longer countenance. We will no longer capitulate. We will no longer agree to be mesmerized by our own human consciousness. We will no longer agree to be chained or imprisoned to its limiting senses of what are reality. Instead, we will turn the tables on that and use the power of the God presence, the consciousness of the mighty I am presence, and the fulcrum of this unfed flame within the bodies as the fulcrum for the light rays of the I am presence to expand from within out and to really and truly, once and for all, take dominion over the four lower bodies. Now, in order for this to happen, really and truly, there are a few things that you do have to come to terms with. One of which is that you can't be sympathetic for your own human self much, and never mind anybody else's for the time being. You can be compassionate all day long for their heart flame and their I am presence. But there is no sympathy for your human self or a sympathy for the devil, so to speak. Not that we believe in a devil in the traditional sense. We don't. But you cannot have a sympathy or a wishy-washy position when it comes to this mortal consciousness of the outer self. If you have that, what you have is struggle. You have relative good and evil in an arm wrestling contest. Sometimes relative good wins out for a while, but then it tires out and relative evil starts winning out. And there's this hypnotic pendulum swing of mortal consciousness that has been going on for hundreds and thousands of embodiments in most cases. That will never be over with as long as you agree to play by those rules. If that is your view of life, that there's good things humanly and bad things humanly, and that life is a salt and pepper potpourri of those things, you're going to have a fixed cycle to the path. And sooner or later, you will tire out and you'll slip back into the old self and the old ways. That won't work. What has to happen is that there must be the categorical and absolute uncompromising position that the light is the power of the presence, and that light can and will take its God dominion over everything that is less than the perfection of the I Am presence, that you will call forth that light, you will send it forth, and you won't leave one crocodile tear to fall down your face in sympathy for the old human ways that were so nostalgic and so sentimental and so appealing in their own way. It's a dangerous no man's land to try to equivocate in that way. You're playing by the rules of relative good and evil. And by those rules, you are bound, at the best, to end in a draw. And a draw is not a victory. What you have to have is the absolute victory over those conditions. And what this means is that the unfed flame must be in God control and in charge of a renovated, resurrected, purified memory, in charge of the mind, in charge of every bit of the emotions, and in charge of everything in the etheric double, and in charge of everything in the physical world. So that involves a certain education of your consciousness to the approach to this path that is really not the approach of the penitent, of the sinner, of the one who is bowing and scraping before a God outside of themselves. You have to really learn how your own I Am presence conducts itself and carries itself, as is illustrated in the face of the firstborn decree. And you must allow that overshadowing of that august personage, that individuality of your presence, to speak through the Christ of your own selfhood and to absolutely take dominion over every lesser condition in a most absolute and categorical way. Rest assured, one of the things that you can know with absolute certitude is that in the consciousness of your electronic body, of your mighty I Am presence, there are no worlds of unreality. Not larger worlds or personal worlds. Your mighty I Am presence never has, never does, never will lower its attention in acknowledgement of a condition that is less than God perfection in its own realm. And you want it to be that way. Furthermore, in reality, at that level, your mighty I Am presence doesn't even recognize such things as time, doesn't recognize space, doesn't recognize a limited condition of any sort. It recognizes only its untrammeled, unfettered, God-free exaltation of God perfection going on for all eternity from that white fire core of the great central sun. And anytime, even one ray of that presence is directed into any condition as an unmitigated ray of that presence, that ray goes forth, and there is the 100% total annihilation of that condition. So long as there are no reluctant Sheila sinews that are really secretly, consciously or subconsciously, not really wanting to fully release that old pattern of life into the flame. Even if you don't know that you're unwilling to surrender something, if you are unwilling to surrender it and you pray fervently to God to release it, it's going to be a long, protracted process for that to go into the flame, because the laws of octaves and the laws of free will are so uncanny and so scientifically precise that the law, being what it is going to be blunted. The light is going to be blunted in its ability to handle those conditions. That's why it's so necessary to take out your handkerchief and say sayonara to everything of this world. Sing happy trails to everything of human creation and say, may we never meet again. Happy trails to you. Good luck. I am aiming my attention and my light into the light of the sun, and I am going into that presence. The word that comes to mind, the action that you have been schooled in by beloved Saint Germain that comes to mind in this regard is the word annihilation. Now, that word is very often associated with human creation. And those who really aren't familiar with the Ascended Master's terminology might think that that is referring to the blessed heart flames of human beings. Nothing could be further from the truth. Human creation of whatever ilk is a reference to the overlay of misqualification by the carnal mind, by the mortal consciousness that has imprisoned the pure light of God in patterns of imperfection. And so that is human creation. And the annihilation is of those overlays, regardless of how entrenched they might seem to be. It is the absolute perfect erasure of them. Right now, those overlays exist in what, for want of a better term, you could say is the memory of nature. Nature is remembering them in the air, in the water, and in the earth associated with this planetary home. They don't exist in the memory of God. They don't exist in the mind of God. They don't exist in either your causal body realm, nor do they exist in the realm of your Christ presence. They have a glass ceiling. They can't go any further into reality than the threshold, the lowest level of the Buddhic world, the realm of the Christ presence. So there, those records are enshrouded in that cave of mortality. So there must be that annihilation of that. And you're not going to leave a vacuum after they have been erased. You are going to call for the threefold flame to fill that void where those patterns used to be, with the superior patterns of the heart and mind of the mighty I Am presence. You have no idea, really no idea, how hidebound is the outer mind. And I include in that the memory body. In times past, we invented a mythological hybrid that was half rhinoceros and half hippopotamus. And if you imagine the thick, leathery, pockmarked hide of that unfortunate behemoth, that is a good analogy of the memory body, which has this leathery, reptilian vibe about it that is so impervious to the light. it has its own doubt. Its main theme is doubt of God. Its main thrust is of the earth, earthy. It doesn't look towards God, it looks to the earth. It looks to materiality. And people who are really in that rhinopotamus or hipposaurus of that carnal mind are likely to be the most materialistic individuals. And many times they will be the most invested in the creature appetites of this outer world. And to a certain extent, even students of the light must deal with that incredulity, that doubting mortal consciousness, that even with all of the evidence that has been brought forth, still has a tendency to, until it is fully ensouled and fully enveloped by the golden plume of the threefold flame, it's going to revert back to those ingrained habit patterns that are many times older than the hills. Literally, that is how long we have been rolling around here on this earth in one civilization after another for so very long. So it requires a very vociferous and a very almost divine fierceness, not that it is stressed or not that it is frothing at the mouth by any means, but it is a very fierce white fire core God command that is going to absolutely take dominion over those conditions. I'll cite for you just one citation of the Master on this subject. Be it now and forever understood that to the student or the disciple on the path who have at last become aware of their mighty I Am presence within themselves, there is no such thing as an adverse condition, regardless of what appearances seem to be. No matter what the appearance seems to be, with the life stream's attention fixed on this recognition, it is impossible for anything but God good to come out of every condition. You can understand and appreciate how it is impossible for God to ever create a condition that would affect God adversely. Therefore, no student should ever, no student can ever maintain their freedom without recognizing and applying this simple yet childish or mighty truth. It's childish and foolish in the recognition of the presence to continue to yield power and authority to outer conditions. Once the students have entered the conscious path, they must understand that they must guard their consciousness for their protection and their defense and their deliverance, knowing positively that God within them is the only authority and the only directing intelligence. My heart yearns for the awakening and the illumination of the students who still keep crying out and voicing day after day and week after week, "Woe is me, how am I to govern my thought? Why don't my affairs come into shape? Why doesn't everything change about swiftly as it should?" Beloved students, may I say to you, in the first place, because you created it. And now you must uncreate it. In the second place, every time you allow that impulse in your consciousness, why? Why, O Lord? When? Where? How? What? In those very questions, you are frittering away your power and giving that power back to those very momentums that you want to be free of. The great necessity of self-correction are the determination to succeed. All who will do this will find themselves forging ahead, time after time, having proof of this mighty active presence. This will give them all of the faith that they need, the courage and faith to place their feet on the neck of the outer human self and hold it subject and obedient to the inner God presence. I had planned on us giving the call, which we will not have the time to do tonight. But in the preambles, the first pages of your Violet Flame calls on pages 22 and 23, you have the calls, for example, mighty I am presence, blaze to me thy consuming flame of divine love. Take my human self-concern, take all habits, desires, and appetites unworthy of thy purity out of me, and annihilate them. Annihilate them, cause, effect, record, and memory, past, present, and future, and replace them with the fullness of yourself, with your full dominion here forever. Over and over again, that term is used, that concept of that annihilation of human creation. You can't be squeamish about it, think that, oh my goodness, I would never be so brutal as to use that concept of annihilation. Well, I tell you, you can't afford to dissimulate when it comes to this steep path, because you really are, to a certain extent, at a certain point on the path at least, still contending with the reverberations of that not-self. And it must be put down, and the golden plume of the threefold flame, the pink plume, the blue plume, those plumes must fill the bodies, and they must exercise their absolute God dominion. And that must be held with an eternal vigilance. Tomorrow we will take up something that is unpopular in modern democracies, and that is the idea of rulership. Admittedly, we're not talking in this case about you or anybody ruling over other people, other heart flames. But there does need to be a re-education about what it means to be a mighty I am presence, what it means to be an ascended master. And the fact is that each and every initiate on the path needs to learn how to conduct themselves in that second secret ray of divine authority and God dominion, and truly learn that part of the reason the purpose-driven life tried to give forth some of these reasons for why human souls were created by God. One of the reasons you are individualized is because God Almighty, the great I am, wishes to expand the borders of the kingdom of God good and needs individualizations of itself at various points in time, space, and eternity, where that God presence is going to issue the command, the conscious, cosmic Christ command to every part of life. So we will work on cultivating that consciousness. All right. Now's the time to walk outside and breathe in the prana. Do a few calisthenics, wake yourselves up, and come back in refreshed and ready to go again. Thank you.